Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange, uncomfortable, and occasionally horrifying world of medieval medicine. A world where diagnosing pregnancy involved more superstition than science. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you think modern medicine can be confusing, imagine living in a world where every person was basically a simmering stew. To the medieval mind, your health depended on the balance of four sacred ingredients: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each one had a personality: cheerful, lazy, angry, or gloomy, and if one got cranky, so did you. Too much black bile, and you were melancholic, which was their charming way of saying probably depressed. Too much yellow bile, and you were choleric, or as we might say today, someone who needs a nap. You, in this medieval world, would have been told that your moods were just weather patterns in your body. A sneeze meant a wind shift. A fever meant your inner sun was rising too high. Doctors were more poets than scientists, and their job was less about healing and more about keeping your inner climate mildly pleasant. Of course, the doctors themselves were a sight to behold. Imagine a man in layered robes, a hat shaped like a squashed mushroom, and a beard that looked like it was grown for gravitas. He greets you not with a thermometer, but with Latin. That's how you know he's serious. In truth, he probably knows less about your body than a baker knows about yeast. But he carries jars, he talks confidently, and he charges by the hour. To diagnose an illness, he'll take your wrist in his hand and stare at you with such solemn intensity you start to believe he's reading your soul. Ah, he might murmur, your humors are restless. You nod, mostly because saying no feels dangerous. Then he examines your urine, because medieval medicine always comes back to pee. Urine was, quite literally, destiny in liquid form. Doctors claimed it held the truth of your soul, its color, its texture, even its smell. There were entire manuals devoted to the art of reading it, with delicate illustrations showing shades of gold, amber, and, if things were going badly, something that looked like rusty soup. If your urine was pale, you were pure. If it was cloudy, you might be pregnant. If it was black, you were probably already halfway to the afterlife. It's hard not to admire the confidence. These physicians had no microscopes, no understanding of germs, and almost no concept of hygiene. Yet they acted as if they'd been personally consulted by God on how the body worked. One famous doctor once declared, with absolute certainty, that a person's health could be improved by sniffing roses and staring at the moon. Another recommended bleeding out a pint of blood for melancholy, then eating a pigeon. Not the whole pigeon, just the heart, for balance. You can almost picture it. The smell of herbs and damp straw in the air, the dim light of a single candle flickering against stone walls, the quiet hum of a village outside. Somewhere, a woman coughs, a pot boils, and a doctor scribbles something incomprehensible in a notebook before declaring you out of harmony. Pregnancy, naturally, was one of the great mysteries. To them, conception wasn't biology, it was magic wrapped in moral judgment. A miracle, a curse, or both. Medieval doctors didn't just wonder if a woman was pregnant, they wondered why God had allowed it. And when you live in a world where religion, superstition, and medicine share the same bed, things get creative fast. That's how pregnancy diagnosis became a kind of performance art. A woman suspects she's with child. The doctor arrives like a prophet with glass jars and a confidence problem. He asks serious questions about her appetite, her complexion, and whether she's been dreaming of water. Then he nods wisely and requests her urine sample. What happens next depends entirely on the region, the decade, and the doctor's imagination. Some would simply stare at the sample for a long time, looking for divine signs, bubbles, sparkles, or reflections of faces. Others would hold it up to the light and whisper a prayer. One particularly bold school of thought insisted that if you whispered the Lord's Prayer over a woman's urine and it shimmered, she was carrying life. If it didn't, she was just tired. Historians still wonder if this shimmer was divine intervention or just candlelight doing its thing. The average medieval household might not have had much medicine, but everyone knew a local remedy or two. Cures were traded like recipes. Oh, you think you're pregnant? Someone might say overbread. Try urinating on barley. And the truly unsettling part is that no one laughed. Because in a world without certainty, even the absurd felt comforting. Everything revolved around balance. The body, the soul, even the seasons. A healer might tell you to drink warm wine in winter, eat cooling cucumbers in summer, and never, under any circumstance, sleep facing north, because that's where the cold winds of death came from. If you were lucky, you'd get a charm to wear around your neck, a dried frog, a gemstone, or a piece of parchment with Latin words no one understood but everyone feared. What's fascinating is how much of this wasn't about cruelty or ignorance. It was about effort. Medieval people wanted answers just as much as we do. They looked into the sky and saw mystery. They looked into a urine flask and saw hope. Every flicker of color, every shifting bubble, was a message from the universe trying to be understood. You sit there, in that candlelit cottage, listening to the rustle of robes and the faint scratch of quills. Outside, the wind hums softly through the thatch. The doctor mutters about your humors being anxious. He looks pleased with himself, and you almost want to applaud. Somewhere in his confusion, there's a kind of poetry, a human attempt to explain the unknowable with whatever tools were at hand. He hands you a cup of herbal wine, something that smells faintly of cinnamon and regret, and advises rest, prayer, and less melancholy. Then he leaves, his robes brushing the doorway, his flask of urine swinging proudly like a badge of honor. You sit back, listening to the fire crackle, wondering how anyone ever survived this long. But they did. Somehow, through bad theories and worse hygiene, humanity kept stumbling forward. And that's where we begin our strange, slow descent into the world of tests, tinctures, and agricultural revelations. Because in the centuries to come, the barley will start to sprout, and someone will look at it and say, life. The year is somewhere between 1350 and 1550. You live in a world that believes in signs. Clouds are omens. Cats are witches in disguise. And if you want to know whether you're pregnant, you don't go to a doctor, you go to your pantry. You take 2 handfuls of grain, 1 barley, 1 wheat, and a small clay pot. Then, you do the unthinkable. You urinate on them. Every drop counts. It's not glamorous, but it's sacred work. Because if the barley sprouts first, the old texts say, you're carrying a boy. If the wheat sprouts, it's a girl. And if neither grows, well, maybe you're just sick or cursed or both. This strange ritual, the barley and wheat test, was one of the most widespread pregnancy tests in the medieval world. It shows up in manuscripts from ancient Egypt, reappears in Greek medicine, and lives on through the Middle Ages like an inherited superstition everyone forgot to question. By the 1300s, it was accepted wisdom, a simple, earthy test that seemed too ordinary to doubt. You can picture it, a woman crouched by a small hearth, her breath fogging the cold air, her hands pressing the damp soil around the seeds. She whispers a prayer and sets the pot aside. Then, every morning, she checks. The tiny grains are like her hope, fragile, silent, full of potential. Days pass. Maybe something green appears, a shy, trembling shoot. She leans close, heart pounding. The barley's awake. She touches the soil, feels warmth where there should be none, and smiles. The test has spoken. Life within life. It sounds poetic now, but it was deadly serious then. Because pregnancy in the Middle Ages wasn't a private affair, it was a social, spiritual, and even political event. For poor women, it might mean another mouth to feed. For noble women, it might mean inheritance, alliance, or danger. And for every woman, it meant risk. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death. So, any method, no matter how absurd, that gave early warning was treated with reverence. The beauty and tragedy of the barley test is that it sometimes worked. Not because of divine guidance, but biology. Scientists in the 1960s actually replicated the experiment and found something astonishing. The urine of pregnant women can indeed make seeds sprout faster, thanks to the high levels of certain hormones. So somewhere in that dim medieval hut, surrounded by smoke and candlelight, superstition had accidentally stumbled onto science. Of course, people didn't know why it worked. To them, the growing barley wasn't a chemical reaction. It was a whisper from heaven. The seed recognized life and responded. The idea had a kind of mystical elegance. Only life can call to life. Still, not every test was so poetic. Some versions included an extra step, boiling the urine. Medieval texts claimed that pure urine of a fruitful woman would produce a soft foam, like beer head. If it burned dark, she was barren. Others recommended mixing the sample with wine, because nothing says medical research like medieval alcohol. The logic was that pregnancy urine would change the wine's nature, which could mean anything from color to smell to taste. Yes, taste. In some corners of Europe, midwives and healers would even drink the mixture to divine its meaning. A bitter taste meant one thing, a sweet aftertaste another. Some said the body's sweetness increased with pregnancy, and wine would reveal it. It's one of those moments in history where curiosity and nausea walked hand in hand. But the barley test remained a favorite, precisely because it was simple and symbolic. You could perform it quietly, in your own home, without priests or physicians. No men needed to know. For women, it was private power, something they could do themselves in a world that allowed them little else. Imagine that small act of rebellion, taking control of knowledge in secret. A wife, a daughter, a widow, all bending over small clay bowls of soil and grain. It's not just a test. It's a ritual of self-awareness. Sometimes, though, the results caused chaos. There are records of midwives being accused of sorcery when the test worked too well. If a woman was declared pregnant before she began to show, it must have been witchcraft. The church frowned upon curiosity that bypassed divine will. Knowing too much about one's own body was considered suspicious. Knowledge, like everything else, was a man's domain. So, the barley test became both sacred and secret, a whisper passed between women, mothers teaching daughters, healers teaching apprentices. They kept their rituals tucked away between pages of recipe books, alongside poultices for fevers and prayers for stillbirths. To the outside world, it looked like superstition, but for them, it was survival. And then, of course, there was the interpretation. Because even when the grain sprouted, what then? What if both barley and wheat grew? Some texts say that meant twins. Others said it meant confusion. Your womb was arguing with itself. Medieval medicine had a fondness for explaining mystery with more mystery. And yet, in the candlelit quiet, there's something hauntingly beautiful about it. The test, the waiting, the fragile life emerging from soil. The woman watching, not as a scientist, but as someone attuned to the rhythms of nature. She's reading the world the only way she can, with faith and patience. A few weeks later, a midwife might visit, wrap her in shawls, and listen for movement, pressing her ear to the belly. But the first sign, the first flicker of hope, came from the barley pot by the fire. And so, for centuries, this humble test persisted, handed down from temple to cottage, from papyrus to parchment, outlasting kings, plagues, and wars. It lived because it felt true. The idea that life recognizes life, that the earth itself responds when something new begins to grow inside you, isn't bad science. It's timeless poetry. And as the fire crackles low, you realize this wasn't medicine in the modern sense. It was a conversation between body and world, between woman and soil, between mystery and hope. Because in a time when knowledge was forbidden, sometimes faith had to do the work of reason. You wake to the smell of smoke and onions. Not the kind simmering in a kitchen, but the kind burning faintly on a brazier beside a bed. You're in a small, dark room, part infirmary, part chapel, part rumor mill. The midwife's hands are stained with herbs, and she's muttering under her breath, half in Latin, half in gossip. She's preparing the onion test. According to certain medieval texts, if a woman suspected pregnancy, the test was simple, though not necessarily pleasant. At night, she'd insert a peeled onion or garlic clove into herself. In the morning, if she could still smell it on her breath, the diagnosis was negative. If not, she was likely pregnant. The logic? The womb was believed to be a hollow creature, with passages that connected directly to the mouth and nose, a kind of internal tunnel system. The female body, in the medieval imagination, was less anatomy and more architecture, a set of mysterious chambers and shifting corridors. They believed the womb could wander through the body like a lost animal, choking, biting, or pressing on organs as it moved. This wandering womb theory was their explanation for everything from hysteria to fainting spells. So if scent could travel up through this inner tunnel, the path was clear, no baby. But if the way was blocked, that meant life had taken root, sealing the passage. The womb had, as they saw it, closed its doors. It's the kind of logic that sounds almost poetic until you remember it involved onions and very uncomfortable evenings. The practice wasn't as rare as you'd think. Versions of it appear in old Arabic medical texts, in early European treatises, even in later Renaissance manuals. For centuries, the onion was a medical instrument, a truth-teller. It appeared in the writings of physicians like Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna, all men of enormous influence, all perfectly willing to treat the female body as both mystery and experiment. You can imagine it, a healer in a dimly lit cottage, bending over a woman who's both anxious and embarrassed. The air is heavy with the smell of tallow candles and damp linen. The healer explains the process in solemn tones, as though this were high science. If the scent travels, she says, you are free of burden. If not, prepare. And then they wait. Morning comes. The test is declared. There is no celebration, only silence. And perhaps, if the result is certain, quiet prayers whispered to Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth. The wandering womb idea didn't die easily. For medieval thinkers, it made sense. They believed the body was animated by invisible vapors, and that scent could travel like spirit. Women were thought to be more porous, more emotional, more open to the world's invisible forces. To them, the womb was not just an organ. It was an intelligence, capable of moods and mischief. Sometimes it wandered upward, suffocating the chest. Sometimes downward, causing paralysis. And sometimes, when neglected, it grew jealous and demanded attention. One medieval text describes the womb as a living thing, greedy for seed. Another compares it to a wild beast that must be tamed. That's the context you have to remember when the onion appears. It wasn't just a test. It was a ritual to tame the invisible, a conversation with a part of the body they both feared and worshipped. Of course, there were variations. Some healers used garlic. Others preferred herbs like rue or sage, believing the plant's fiery nature could awaken a sleepy womb. The scents weren't random, they were symbolic. Garlic, for example, represented strength and protection. If it could not make its presence known, something powerful must be blocking its way. You could almost call it medieval aromatherapy, with consequences. And yet, beneath all the absurdity, there's a deep human pattern, the search for proof, for certainty, for a sign that something invisible has begun to grow. In a world without ultrasound, heartbeat monitors, or even basic understanding of reproduction, the nose became a kind of oracle. Not all these experiments were done by choice. In noble households, where lineage mattered, women's bodies were public property. Servants, midwives, and even physicians might be ordered to perform such tests on queens or mistresses suspected of carrying heirs. The results could determine marriages, wars, or executions. Imagine being 16, married to a lord twice your age, surrounded by whispering courtiers, and told an onion will decide your future. Sometimes, women fought back in small, clever ways. They'd fake symptoms, claim morning sickness, or feign cravings to buy time. Some swapped urine samples. Others tampered with the test itself, adding herbs to mask scent or alter reactions. In a system designed to strip them of control, even small acts of deceit became survival. And sometimes, the test simply failed. The scent was faint, the healer unsure, the results contradictory. Then came the second opinion, a more spiritual approach. Monks or priests might be called to bless the woman or pray for clarity. They'd hold candles near her stomach, looking for flickers, or interpret dreams for divine messages. Dreams were considered diagnostic tools. If a woman dreamt of water, it meant pregnancy. If she dreamed of fire, illness. If she dreamt of holding fruit, she was blessed. If she dreamed of eating it, cursed. The line between prophecy and diagnosis blurred completely. In a way, these rituals were humanity's earliest attempts to interpret the body as text. The urine, the onion, the barley. They were words in a language no one fully understood. Each test, each superstition, was a letter in that long, messy correspondence between body and belief. And in that correspondence, you can sense the quiet fear of the age, fear of the unknown, fear of women's power, fear of life itself, the idea that something invisible and uncontrollable could bloom within. So, when you see the image of a healer holding an onion to the light, her hands trembling, her eyes searching for meaning, you're not looking at foolishness. You're looking at yearning, a raw, unscientific hope to understand the miracle that still mystifies us today. Because even now, centuries later, we haven't entirely stopped asking the same question. Is there life within me? We've just traded onions for ultrasound. The room grows quiet again. The candle burns low. The midwife crosses herself, sets the onion aside, and whispers, "The body has spoken." And outside, in the chill before dawn, the first rooster crows, announcing another day in a world still trying to understand itself. By now, you've seen that medieval pregnancy tests were less about biology and more about theater, a ritual of gestures, smells, and whispered prayers. But this next part takes us deeper into the realm where medicine blurs with magic, where fire, metal, and dreams become diagnostic tools, and the human body turns into a stage for divine messages. You're in a physician's chamber now, not a humble midwife's hut, but the domain of a learned man. Shelves are stacked with glass vials, leeches, and brass instruments that glint like relics. The air hums with heat and incense. He doesn't crouch beside a hearth or murmur prayers. He experiments. Or at least, he thinks he does. He asks for your urine, of course, and pours it into a polished bronze basin. Then he holds it over a flame. The surface ripples, catches the light, and begins to steam. He leans close, eyes narrowing. This is not superstition, he insists. This is observation. If the liquid thickens into white foam, pregnancy. If it darkens and smells, rank, sickness. If it hisses, he steps back, pretending not to flinch. In medieval alchemy, everything was a reflection of the cosmos. Fire purified, metal revealed, water transformed. The same logic that turned lead into gold was used to detect life in a woman's womb. A pregnancy test, in this light, wasn't just about the body. It was about transformation. The soul, the seed, and the elements themselves were believed to echo one another in a cosmic chain. So, fire became a revealer of truth. It tested not just matter, but destiny. Some physicians took it further. They'd drop a small iron key into the sample and let it sit overnight. In the morning, if rust appeared, the woman was said to be closed, her womb sealed by pregnancy. If the key stayed bright, her body remained open. The symbolism is almost too poetic. The key, the lock, the secret door within. You can see why they believed it. Elsewhere, midwives used beeswax candles instead. They dripped the wax into a bowl of urine and study how it hardened. A smooth surface meant fertility, ripples or bubbles meant barrenness. The candle flame was thought to carry divine judgment, a tongue of holy fire that told no lies. And then there were the dream tests. Dreams were medicine's invisible laboratory. Physicians, monks, and wise women all agreed that the body revealed its hidden truths during sleep. If a woman dreamt of flowing rivers, she was likely pregnant. If she dreamed of chains, something was obstructed. If she dreamt of carrying a loaf of bread, the child would be healthy. If the bread crumbled, tragedy awaited. One famous 15th century text claimed that a woman who dreamt of holding a mirror was with child and will bear a girl, while one who dreamt of fire shall bear a boy, fierce and full of humors. The logic was symbolic but surprisingly consistent. Water, softness, and reflection were feminine. Heat, motion, and brightness were masculine. The womb wasn't just a place. It was a prophecy. For noble women, dreams were recorded in diaries and discussed with priests. For peasants, they were whispered over washing tubs or traded like folk songs. A midwife might wake in the night and say she felt a movement in her sleep, a premonition that her client's body had changed. And in the quiet hours before dawn, such intuition was treated as fact. Then there was the mirror test. In some households, women were told to breathe upon a polished piece of metal, a mirror, a dagger blade, or even a priest's chalice. If the condensation left no trace, they were pregnant. If it left a visible mark, they were not. The idea was that a pregnant woman's breath was pure, no longer clouded by the excess vapors of unspent seed. It sounds ridiculous, but remember, medieval people believed in correspondences. To them, breath was life, reflection was soul, and metal was truth. When you breathed onto the mirror, you weren't just testing your lungs. You were speaking to the universe, and the results, however random, could alter everything. In the records of one Italian abbess, a young nun was accused of fornication. Her urine test came back unclean, her mirror clouded. She swore her innocence, but the test spoke louder than words. They locked her away in a cell to await God's revelation. Months later, she miscarried. Proof, they said, that the tests were right all along. It didn't occur to them that starvation, isolation, and fear could have done the same. The obsession with signs, with reading the invisible, ran deep. Even men weren't exempt. There were fertility tests for husbands too, though they were less advertised. One involved heating a man's urine and dropping in a live louse. If it swam, he was potent. If it died, he was sterile. Humanity's creativity, it seems, had no shame. But it wasn't all grotesque. There was a strange poetry in these rituals, a belief that every element, every spark, every breath was a messenger. The body was a riddle written by God, and each test was an attempt to read it. Fire, metal, grain, breath, all parts of the same divine alphabet. And maybe that's what keeps this world so haunting. Beneath the absurdity is reverence. A candle wasn't just a candle. It was a sliver of sunlight trapped on earth. A key wasn't just a tool. It was the symbol of knowledge. Every act, however small, carried weight. You can almost smell the room. Wax, smoke, iron, and something faintly sour. The physician stirs the basin one last time, frowning at the foam. He writes in his ledger, a sign of fruitfulness. Then he closes it and sends for a midwife. You, sitting by the fire, realize that this is what medicine once was. Not the clean certainty of lab coats, but a fever dream of symbols. And as the candle gutters and the metal cools, you can't help but feel a strange kinship with them. Because even now, we still stare at screens, at lines and colors, searching for signs that life has begun. The difference is only in the light we use. The room smells of lavender and ash. The physician is gone now. In his place stands someone older, quieter, and infinitely more competent, a midwife. Her hands are rough, her voice soft. She doesn't wear silk robes or carry Latin scrolls. What she has is something rarer, experience. For centuries, midwives were the invisible pillars of medieval medicine. They worked in secret, in whispers, under candlelight. They knew the sounds of labor, the smell of infection, the color of danger. They were part healer, part priestess, part confidant. And when it came to pregnancy, they were the only ones who truly understood what was at stake. She doesn't need barley, onions, or fire. She watches, listens, and touches lightly. Her diagnosis comes from rhythm, the pulse at your wrist, the tone of your skin, the weight of your silence. She can tell if something is wrong just by the way you breathe. But even she must tread carefully. By the late Middle Ages, the church had grown wary of women who knew too much. Healing, after all, meant power. And power that came from the body was suspect. For centuries, midwives had been protected by custom. Every village needed one. When a child was born, she was called first, not a priest, not a doctor. She washed the newborn, tied the cord, whispered prayers. She even baptized infants on the verge of death, because waiting for a priest might cost a soul. That small act, saving a soul without permission, made her both essential and dangerous. The church began to notice. By the 13th and 14th centuries, clerical texts started to draw lines. Midwives were to be watched carefully, their practices examined for superstition. Manuals warned that women who used herbs or charms risked consorting with demons. Any ritual not explicitly blessed by the church could be the devil's counterfeit. Imagine being her, kneeling by a bed, blood on your hands, whispering words of comfort, only to be accused of witchcraft for knowing how to stop a hemorrhage. Midwives were often the last line between life and death. They worked without instruments, without pain relief, without light. Their tools were simple: cloths, knives, herbs, and faith. They relied on recipes passed from woman to woman, some practical, some mystical. A salve made from honey and ash for tearing. A charm written on parchment to ease the pains of Eve. But what made them truly dangerous, in the eyes of the powerful, was their autonomy. They didn't need permission to act. They didn't wait for men to explain their own bodies to them. They knew when a child had died in the womb. They knew when a mother wouldn't survive the night. They knew, often before anyone else, whether life had begun or ended. And in a world obsessed with control, with property, lineage, purity, that kind of knowledge was intolerable. By the 15th century, midwifery manuals began to shift tone. They were no longer guides for midwives, but rules about them. Let no woman practice without witness. One decree ordered. Let her be known to the parish priest. Some towns forced midwives to take oaths, swearing never to use unholy means to know or influence conception. The irony is that these unholy means were often the only ones that worked. The barley test, the onion, the herbs, all condemned as superstition, had kept women alive. They weren't perfect, but they were practical. They cost nothing, required no permission, and answered questions medicine refused to face. When the church finally declared that God alone could reveal pregnancy, it wasn't about truth. It was about authority. To admit that a woman could discover life on her own, without divine intercession, was unthinkable. So, the knowledge had to be branded as dangerous. Witch trials followed. The line between healer and heretic blurred completely. In inquisitorial records, you can find testimonies that read like nightmares. Women accused of using herbs to prevent or detect conception, of summoning life without prayer, of invoking demons through urine. A handful of dried barley grains could become evidence of sorcery. An onion under the bed could mean a pact with the devil. And yet, the midwives continued. Quietly, patiently. They passed their knowledge in secret, disguised as recipes, hymns, or housework. Add salt to the bathwater for purity, they'd say, meaning infection. Pray with rosemary by your side, they'd whisper, meaning antiseptic. Every test, every trick, every superstition was a survival manual coded in faith. Picture it, a small cottage on the edge of a village. The church bell tolls somewhere far away. A woman labors inside, her breath shallow, her face pale. The midwife kneels beside her, murmuring in rhythm with her gasps. She wipes the sweat from her brow, listens for a heartbeat, and feels the faint flutter of life. Outside, snow begins to fall. She doesn't need a priest to tell her what that flutter means. She knows. She's known for centuries. And when the child finally cries, she closes her eyes and whispers, "Welcome to the world, little one. You've survived the age of miracles and mistakes." Outside, the village sleeps. Inside, history breathes, in the quiet, patient hands of women who defied ignorance by knowing too much. And so the story ends, not with the physicians or the priests, but with them, the nameless women who bridged the distance between superstition and science, between fear and faith. The church wrote the books, the doctors wrote the theories, but the midwives wrote the truth, one birth, one breath, one secret test at a time.